essential questions. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for our 10th episode of Netting Zero, a virtual event series on climate change brought to you by the New York Times. I am Whitney Richardson, the International Events Manager for the Times. It's such a pleasure to have you all with us today, joining us from around the world as we gather experts to discuss how we can reimagine transport, logistics, and e-commerce for a net zero world. This topic couldn't be more important as we're now just a few weeks out from COP26, the major climate negotiations taking place in Scotland this November. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, our ambition with our Netting Zero virtual event series is to elevate solutions in the climate debate and to create a platform for more informed and diverse conversation around climate action leading up to COP. These virtual episodes are not just leading us to COP though, but also to the New York Times Climate Hub, a 10-day hybrid event in Glasgow as well as virtually, where we will be gathering innovators, youth change makers, policymakers to discuss how we scale climate solutions. Tickets for the New York Times Climate Hub are now on sale, and you can visit us at nytclimatehub.com to learn more. I would also like to thank our sponsor for today's session, Tikehau Capital, for bringing this event to life. Today's discussion will be led by my colleague, Brad Plumer, one of the leading climate reporters at the New York Times. Brad specializes in policy and technology efforts to cut carbon dioxide emissions. He has also covered international climate talks and the changing energy landscape in the United States for the Times. Stick around until the end of the session, where we will share exclusive access to view the international premiere screening of the documentary film After Antarctica. This will be followed by a Q&A between my colleague and journalist at the Times, Veronica Chambers, as well as director and producer of the film, Tasha Zand, and explorer Will Steger. I also want to encourage those of you who are watching on YouTube to submit your questions through the live stream chat function. With that, I will hand it over to Brad to lead us through today's discussion with our dynamic speakers. Welcome, Brad.
All right, thank you, Whitney, and thank you everyone for joining us virtually. I'm Brad Plumer, a reporter at the New York Times, and I'm thrilled to be here with our other panelists to talk about the climate impacts of transportation, freight, e-commerce, and what we can do about it. So joining us today to talk about this, we have Angela Hultberg of IKEA, Samantha Gross of the Brookings Institution, Mitch Jackson of FedEx, Tom Grundy of Airlander, Johannah Christensen of the Global Maritime Forum, Sharon Cullinane of the University of Gothenburg, and Celine Simon of Slow Factory. So for our discussion today, I just kind of wanted to set the stage. Transportation is such an enormous part of the climate picture. It's about 1/5 of all the carbon dioxide that humanity puts into the atmosphere. And scientists keep telling us over and over, if we want to avoid the worst consequences of global warming, nations are going to need to zero out those emissions in just a few short decades. But when we talk about transportation, there's often so much focus on personal vehicles, on our cars, SUVs, how we might clean those up by shifting to electric vehicles or public transportation or biking. And that's all really important. But a huge chunk of transportation that doesn't get nearly as much attention is shipping, basically. Delivery vans in cities, long distance, heavy trucks bringing goods across the country, massive container ships circling the globe, and of course, airplanes. And this is a sector where the possible solutions are not always quite as clear. You can pretty easily electrify a car, but it's not so easy to power an airplane by batteries. So we're going to take a look at some of the technologies that might seem promising here, look at what companies and governments are doing to decarbonize this aspect of transportation. But we're also going to ask, does the world need to rethink how it ships goods around? Is the rise of e-commerce and one-click shopping through Amazon making the task of cutting emissions easier or harder? So now I'm going to turn things over to Angela Hultberg, who is also the transport lead for the Climate Champions team at COP26, and she is going to set the challenge for our speakers.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I think it's fair to say we're in a race here, and it's a race to a healthier, fairer, more resilient world. And I think the IPCC report was a quite sobering read when it comes to the pace we need to be on to do that. We desperately need to accelerate. And as you laid out perfectly here, Brad, transport is a significant part of the climate crisis, and we desperately need to decarbonize. And we can absolutely do it. It's not going to be easy, but it's absolutely doable. And there are so many trends affecting how we transport goods right now. Not only e-commerce, which is, of course, has a huge impact on how we deliver goods because it comes down to customer expectations. But it's also other trends like digitalization, urbanization, income inequality gaps. So much now really has a huge impact on transport. And while we know that we desperately need to change, and it's an industry that, in some aspects are performing deliveries basically the same way we have done since horse and carriage, we're maybe not extremely sure on exactly how to make those changes because there's so many stakeholders, so many moving parts, if you will. So my challenge here to the panelists we have today, and I'm really looking forward to hearing their insights, is really how do we meet people's needs? How do we keep accessibility, convenience, things that our customers expect? How do we keep all of that at the same time as we're transforming and contributing to a healthier, more sustainable world and healthier and more sustainable cities for everyone?
Thanks so much, Angela. Before we bring in the speakers, we have gotten some audience questions from so many of the people joining us. Angela, could you read a few of those out? And this will be something for our panelists to keep in mind as we're discussing these issues.
Absolutely. So we have a great question from Olivia Parrott from Iowa asking, what can individual people do to lower international flight and shipping emissions, either in their own lives or politically? And I think that's a really good question to keep in mind. We also have a question from Thomas Van Hoff from Belgium asking, how can we get international agreements on carbon tax so the true cost of transport is being reflected in the price of goods, regardless of where they are produced around the world? So I think those speak a lot to the industry and also to individuals.
That's great. Those are great questions. Let's move to our first panel with Samantha Gross and Mitch Jackson. And we want to talk about the broader challenge here and possible solutions. Samantha, I'd love to start with you. What is it about freight that makes decarbonization and cutting emissions so technically challenging?
It's really a question of energy density. Fossil fuels carry about 40 times the energy per unit of weight or volume as a state-of-the-art battery. And this isn't such a big deal for vehicles that carry light loads or that can refuel frequently, like passenger vehicles. Plus, an electric drivetrain is simpler and lighter than an internal combustion engine, and so you get some of that weight back in a passenger vehicle. But for vehicles that need to carry heavy loads for long distances without opportunities to refuel, the energy-dense nature of fossil fuels is really important, and it's really difficult to replace.
So, Mitch, I'd love to hear a bit more about what this looks like from FedEx's perspective. You're shipping goods all across the world by land, by sea, by air. What are some of the challenges the company's dealing with as it tries to figure out how to do this in a lower emissions way?
Well, first off, it's great to be with you today, Brad. So thanks for having me. I think the comment about energy density is an important starting discussion with respect to this, because it does come down to that issue of energy density. When you're talking about moving goods in the shipment of freight, those aspects of payload capacity are paramount with respect to what you're doing, because everything actually derives from that issue of payload capacity and the energy density of the fuel that you're using, the energy source itself. So it is a critical issue. It's why many companies use spoke and hub systems, as FedEx does by and large as well, because you get density of packages, you get density of freight with respect to the shipments, and it helps move that stuff so that you get the most efficient and highest ton mile capabilities out of the freight components of what you're doing.
So I'd be curious. I mean, obviously, companies all over the world that are involved in shipping, they have all the incentive to try to do things more efficiently. That can save them money, and it can probably cut emissions at the margins. But if we're looking at the bigger climate challenge, it's not enough to get a little more efficient. We kind of have to get to zero emissions or as close to it as possible. So I'd ask both of you, and maybe start with Samantha. What do potential solutions for moving all the goods we have around the world, with zero emissions? What do some of those solutions potentially look like? What are some of the best ideas that are out there?
It's a great question. And what it comes down to is that you need a zero carbon fuel that looks and acts somewhat like the fuels we have today, that has an energy dense nature, that's easier to move around. Potentials are hydrogen made from green electricity, perhaps some biofuels, although there are land use implications with that. Perhaps we could even make synthetic fuels by combining captured CO2 with hydrogen to actually recreate the hydrocarbons that we use today, only not from fossil fuel sources. This is a very energy intensive process. You're basically running combustion backwards. But if you have enough zero carbon electricity from renewables or other zero carbon sources, it's something you could do, and it's something that could potentially solve some of the absolute most difficult fossil fuel uses to replace.
So, Mitch, I'd be curious. I mean, is from your perspective, is FedEx looking at some of this, and what makes it hard to implement these different technologies?
Well, for FedEx, I mean, our strategy with respect to sustainability is what we call a reduce, replace, revolutionize strategy. So it's reduce or eliminate the impacts from operations, find the right solutions and put them in the right applications, and then find the solutions of tomorrow and start implementing them today. So you have to do all of those things, I think, concurrently. I mean, because that really gets at the near term, the medium term, and the long term aspects. If you think about transportation operations as it relates to freight transport, electrification is a great solution for the future, for the near term, as it relates to centralized vehicles, such as for FedEx, for our pickup and delivery vehicles. And that's why we've set a goal to electrify all of our parcel pickup and delivery vehicles globally by 2040. And then we have interim goals as well in 2025 and 2030 with respect to those vehicles as well. But it gives you that capability and that application, range, capacity, payload, and a clean energy source as utilities are decarbonizing to be able to get to a zero carbon operation or a zero carbon transport sector as it relates to those centralized pickup and delivery vehicles.
So, I'd ask either of you, one thing that's interesting about this sector is we don't necessarily know what the answer will be. I mean, maybe a completely decarbonized FedEx, there are lots of electric vehicles, delivering goods in cities. But in terms of, what is actually flying packages around the world, it's hard to say. At this point, maybe it's planes running on green hydrogen. Maybe it's something else. It might be tough to do it purely with batteries. But I'm curious, maybe Samantha, you can start. What does policy look like when we don't know the technological answer? Is it a question of, putting a tax on carbon emissions and letting companies try to figure out for themselves? Or is it potentially more complicated than that?
I think it's a mixed policy landscape. I completely agree with Mitch that there are some uses even in freight that are easier to electrify. These delivery vehicles that go back and forth, small distances, go back to central fueling stations, you can electrify that, and policy should push for that. Whereas for the more difficult uses, a carbon tax helps, but you need a very, very high carbon tax to push some of these replacement fuels. And they're also not commercially available yet. And so you need a combination of demand pull by requiring reductions in emissions. You need a push on technology to help get these technologies developed and implemented and commercialized. And you also need very clear future policy so that companies understand why they need to develop and commercialize these fuels. If there's a clear pathway and policy towards zero emissions, there's a commercial opportunity there that companies can see, and they understand that they need to work hard to get there. And so this clear landscape that makes it clear that we're moving in that direction, but is somewhat agnostic towards the technologies itself, I think is what makes sense to me for the most difficult sectors.
So we've been talking a lot about, how do we make cleaner vehicles? What do cleaner airplanes look like? What do cleaner container ships look like? And that's a big challenge in itself. But are there ways in which we need to rethink the sort of system of shipping and transportation at all? And this could be broad. Maybe it's a question of, might companies want to think about sort of bringing manufacturing closer to where customers are to reduce the distance? Or maybe it's resetting people's expectations about how quickly packages should arrive. But I'm curious, maybe I can start with Mitch and ask Samantha as well. Is this a place where shipping companies may need new business models, or is it really just a pure technological question?
Well, in some ways, I think it's both. There's the technology aspect and the operational aspect as well. Clearly, if you look at many transportation companies, and FedEx is no different in that, we have a myriad of different services that we offer that are both for offshore and nearshore operations and manufacturing capabilities. So we have FedEx Express for the express movement piece of it, and we have FedEx Ground and FedEx Freight for North American transport as well, both parcel and what's called less than truckload, but heavy freight. So I think the capabilities that shipping companies and freight companies need to take that into account. But you can't lose sight of the need for innovation as it relates to these different things and the role that you play in society. We have 4 building blocks of our strategy. That's performance, transparency, innovation, and leadership. Innovation is a key component of that because you've got to be able to innovate. And I think the fact of it is that innovation. I've defined innovation as applied inspiration. There's an action inherently included in that. You have to actually take action in order to innovate, and so it's not a theoretical discussion on that. But I think that piece of it, that operational efficiency and operational improvement and a technological focus are paramount if we're going to be sustainable into the future, not only for society, but for our industry and for the companies therein.
Samantha, any thoughts on sort of, whether business models need to change or the way we think about how we transport goods around the world?
I think some business models may change. I think what you may see happen is more focus on local goods, shortening of supply chains and onshoring supply chains for some goods. But there will always be goods that make sense to be traded internationally because of anything from where resources are located to labor costs to natural advantages of things in certain parts of the world. And so the idea is that long distance freight will always be with us. And so I agree with Mitch on this. We apply the innovations that we already have. We continue to innovate going forward for those things where we really need long distance shipping. And in others where it's possible to onshore to shorten the supply chains, you can go that direction as well. I think this is really a mixed solution. There's no silver bullet for any of this.
So can I ask one last question about the policy aspect? So right now, we have these sort of international forums for both aviation and shipping, the IKEA for aviation, the IMO for shipping. they've met a lot over the years. They've come up with different plans. Those plans have often been criticized sometimes as pretty marginal, but it's also a hard problem to crack. Do you feel like the policy efforts underway right now are sufficient to really decarbonize these sectors, or do we need a lot more? And I'd ask Samantha first, and then I'll turn to Mitch.
Sure. The policy is not going far enough right now, but the trick is that the technology hasn't caught up. In order to change the fuel in aviation or international shipping, let's say, that fuel needs to be available everywhere that these ships and planes go. And so it's really a global problem, and you need these global groups to deal with it. So I think it's up to those groups somewhat, but also up to governments in wealthy countries to push for innovation in these sectors and make those fuels, help get them developed and make them commercially available, so then the aviation and maritime industries can adopt them. Right now, I think more needs to be done, but it's difficult for those groups to do it because it's still a technology question.
Right. And Mitch, real quick, last question. I mean, what do you see a role for policy, whether it's regulations or R&D or other things that to sort of help companies clean up their businesses?
Absolutely. I mean, Samantha is right in her prior comments with respect to policy. Policy sets the direction for where society and for where business sectors need to go with respect to that. I think the issue and the trap often is for policy is not only do they tell you exactly what they want you to do, but they tell you this is the only way you can do it. And that's a trap. I mean, basically, it limits and stifles innovation and thought with respect to the different solutions to get there. We often deal with a concept called the license to operate, right? That the value we bring to society outweighs some of the detrimental impacts. But I think that there's another aspect of a license, and that's a license to optimize. And so I think policy's role is to set the general direction or the specific direction that they want businesses to go in, and then empower them to unleash the power of innovation to find those solutions that can do that without simply saying or limiting it to one or two different solutions, because that limits innovation. It limits the power of creative thinking. And so I think that is a critical issue, but it doesn't negate and it doesn't diminish the need for policy. That's a paramount issue with respect to this issue as we go forward, because it's a societal global issue, and we've got to be able to have those groups do it. And you talked about IKEA in the issue of aviation. It's important to realize that ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, is a part of the UN. And the UN has been looking at how to solve this issue around climate for decades now. And I think those are critical organizations to help in this solution that spans the globe.
So thank you both. We're going to move to our next panel, and then we'll bring both of you back into the conversation so we can all speak together. So my next panel, we're going to look a little more broadly at potential solutions to this huge transportation sector. And I want to bring everyone in. And Johannah, I think I'd start with you and some of your work with the Global Maritime Forum. So, big ships around the world, major source of emissions, big climate challenge. Do you think, I'm curious what you think the sort of role for policy is here, and whether, given the speed at which, scientists are saying we really need to decarbonize, I mean, can we sort of afford to wait for the right green technologies to come along to decarbonize this sector?
No, I don't believe we can wait. I think Angela rightfully mentioned at the beginning of this discussion the urgency of the challenge, and we just can't sit around and wait. And in fact, many companies across the maritime sector, shipping companies, engine manufacturers, shipbuilders, and the like, so the entire ecosystem is working together on coming up with the solutions. There are over 100 projects underway that we're aware of. We did a mapping of pilots and demonstration projects at a global level. And we identified, just with some desktop research, over 100 different projects that are underway where different stakeholders across kind of the sector are working together on testing, developing concept studies, testing technologies, trying to put them to use in order to put us on a path to meet some of these the climate goals that have been set.
Can you just give us like one or two specific examples of things that, who knows if they'll work out, but might seem promising?
Yeah, so for example, in the Nordic region, I'm based in Copenhagen, there's a group of companies that's working together on a ammonia-powered vessel that's going to be, it's an ammonia carrier. So it's going to burn the goods, basically the cargo that it carries in its engines as well. So they just completed a few months ago their concept study, and the next phase will be to actually develop and to start develop concrete designs, as well as the business model around this particular vessels that would be operating in the Baltic Sea. It's a collaboration between all the different stakeholders that need to be involved. So it's both the shipping company that owns and operates the ship. It's the company that has the cargo, but also produces the fuel in this instance. It's an ammonia producer called Yara, based out of Norway and Sweden. It's engine manufacturer from Finland and the like. So it's a whole range of different companies working together. And banks, I think, is a really important part of this as well. So financial institutions that are going to be the ones that are going to put up risk-pulling capital on something that is, as of yet, an unproven technology, and especially at scale. So this is what's needed in order to kickstart the transition to fuels that that are not yet mature.
Got it. Sharon, I'm interested in your perspective on this. We've heard a lot about technological solutions, again, for sort of vehicles. Maybe we should power ships with ammonia, and that could be really promising. But, is there also a way in which potentially we should rethink our broader approach to how we move goods around the globe?
Well, I think, to my own perspective, I think we need to think about what we do as consumers. I mean, it's very interesting to look at what we can do on a grand scale on the hardware, if you like, but there's also our own behaviour. I mean, how often do we order things? How much do we order things that we don't really need to come tomorrow, for instance, rather than ordering them for a week's time? We have to think about our own behaviour and educate ourselves as to what the consequences of ordering things are, and not to overorder, and not to actually think, to educate ourselves more in the environmental sustainability area. But that's actually quite difficult because there are so many different conflicting stories all the time, and it's quite difficult to actually find an objective way of actually carbon auditing, if you like, your own behaviour. And as an example for that, my own research centres on returns of clothing, and I can ask a person who thinks that they're really, really environmentally friendly in their behaviour, and yet when I ask them about how often they send back their clothes that they've ordered online, they say, yes, they haven't really thought about that as being an environmental issue. But of course it is, because many of our clothes travel halfway around the world before they actually are resold again. And that involves a lot of logistics. So I think we have to look at the hardware, we have to look at the fuels, but we also have to look at human behaviour and to educate ourselves in the way of actually reducing the need for the transport as well.
I want to follow up on that with Tom, because your company, Airlander, as I understand, is developing these sort of hybrid airships, which I think it's wrong to call them blimps, but they kind of, just for people who aren't familiar, are sort of more advanced versions of that, which could be very low emissions, but also, don't necessarily, as I understand it, move as fast as today's airplanes, but, potentially a very promising solution for air transport. So would that mean we'd need to sort of rethink our expectations for fast freight in some cases? Because that, maybe speaks a little to Sharon's point about thinking more broadly about our expectations around shipping.
Well, thank you, Brad. I think it does talk to the need and the opportunity to think a little differently about how we do things. And I think that's part, perhaps, of reframing the problem that we've got in aviation, which is this huge problem that we've built the whole of the aviation system around kerosene, which has driven us in the direction of fast aircraft flying very high, takeoff and landing from high value infrastructure in airports. If we're going to move away from kerosene, there's going to be a big role for drop-in fuels that we've talked about before, but the scale that we talked about earlier, but the scale-up challenges for those are enormous. So if we look more broadly, there are big parts of what we do in aviation today that if we change the technology base that we're using, we can start to reframe the problem as a system level change, a rethink of how we use the skies to move things around. So for something like Airlander, our technology will deliver 90% fewer emissions in flight. And that comes at the price of a slightly slower flight speed. But we also have the ability to move away from that airfield infrastructure. So reconnect places, reconnect hubs and spokes in a different way, change the system, and deliver a step change in emissions and the things that we do.
Sure. I just want to go back to Sharon real quick. Do you think it's possible for consumers, given that we're so used now, at least in wealthy developed countries, to sort of one-click shopping, it's there the next day. Do you think it's possible for people to shift those expectations into something that maybe, accepts a little less speed in exchange for environmental sustainability?
I think there is a big proportion of the population who would actually like to reduce their carbon footprint, but they don't really know how to do so. So I think a big part of all this is education, and it's basically education, very basic education, to let people know, to make people aware that there are environmental consequences of their actions, because we know that if we drive to the shops, we're in our car, and that produces a big carbon footprint, but we don't necessarily think that when we put something back into the post to be returned to the retailer, that creates as big a carbon footprint as anything else. So I think we really need to have a basic fundamental education of how people understand what environmental consequences are. And as I say, that's so difficult because there's so much greenwashing going on, and every company is trying to say, yes, they're environmentally neutral, etc., which I think a lot of it is just really not very true. And we have to really think about the way we act, basically, in our consumer behavior.
So, Celine, I'd like to follow up with you and make this a little more concrete. So you've thought a lot about how a lot of these supply chain and transportation issues play out in the fashion industry. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about some of the challenges that industry is facing and thinking about how to decarbonize its supply chains and this aspect of sort of moving goods around.
Thank you so much, Brad. And I agree with you, Sharon. It is about education and misinformation at the end of the day. For example, in the US, return shipping creates over 15 million metric tons of carbon dioxide. That's the equivalent of 3 million cars. And that's just by returning goods. And 5 billion pounds of these returned goods end up in the landfill because it is much easier for brands to just throw them or burn them than to reintroduce them back into the market. And then worldwide, there's 17 billion items that are being returned every year, for 4.7 million metric tons of carbon dioxide a year. And if we were able to reduce that just by 10%, we would be able to bring electricity and power 57,000 US homes. So this is just to give you a context of just by returning goods, returning things that we've bought online, it's contributing tremendously in carbon emissions. And that is from, of course, the individual's point of view of purchasing things online in several sizes and returning some of them back into the stores. And these problems are, of course, systemic issues. They're not just relying on the shoulders of the individual. Of course, the individual could refrain from purchasing so many different items online. But at the end of the day, as Sharon noted, it is also the responsibility of the industry, and the fashion industry holds a lot of this responsibility by decentralizing their manufacturing, by also, of course, offering a more just offer to the individual by, for example, figuring out the sizing first and foremost, by working closely with their audience, and of course by limiting this overproduction, because of course there's a overproduction that is being produced. Every single T-shirt has over 100 hands that has touched it. The cotton is grown in a country, shipped to another country to being processed, shipped back to another country to being created. The fashion industry's carbon emission exceeds the aviation industry because it includes also all of the transportation that is being used. And so at the Slow Factory, we look at all of these issues from a systemic point of view.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Johannah, I want to follow up with you. Obviously, the rise of trade, even as it can come with a lot of environmental trade-offs, as we've been hearing about, has been important for a lot of countries around the world for their economic development. Do you think there are potential tensions between, decarbonizing or even rethinking shipping and, concerns around how this could affect economic development? And even if it can be done where we can have both, are there concerns that policymakers should be watching out for as they think about how to reduce the environmental impact of shipping and trade?
Well, certainly, the cost of lower zero emission shipping is anticipated to be significantly higher than the fossil fuel based shipping that we have today, maybe up to 3 or 4 times as expensive, as at least initially. And that, of course, means that countries that are highly trade dependent are worried about the impact on their growth and development of those higher transport costs. And that's a completely legitimate concern. At the same time, there are also tremendous opportunities for a lot of low and middle income countries in the transition to zero emission fuels. So today, the fossil fuels, they come from a specific set of countries, right? But future zero emission fuels that are produced based on renewable energy could come from a whole range of other countries. We're currently working together with stakeholders in South Africa, in Morocco, in Chile, in Mexico, and Indonesia on exploring the opportunities that exist for them in producing zero emission fuels of the future for the shipping sector, but also for other sectors that might be using them.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I would like to talk about how both the role of policy and how that might play out. So, Tom, you are obviously deeply involved in looking at potential technological solutions and trying to bring these to market. I mean, I'm curious what you have seen in your experience as some of the challenges in bringing lower emissions technologies to market. I mean, what are the barriers here?
Well, I think at the highest level, one of the challenges that we need to overcome in bringing new technologies into the market is to unhook from our prior expectations of what aviation looks like. In the aerospace industry, we're very used to one size fits all. Particular types of aeroplanes flying fast. And the question you asked earlier on, I think, is very relevant. Are we prepared to take a little bit more time over a longer journey that reduces our carbon footprint? The point I'd make in return really is that we make those decisions all the time. We often choose to go by a ferry or by road rather than by air. We often choose sea freight over air freight. And so for a technology like ours, we think of it more as a fast ship than a slow aeroplane. When you think about that from in policy terms, we've got energy policy, kerosene and sustainable fuels in aviation. We've got transportation policy considerations, and we've got industrial policy. Big aerospace manufacturers, big parts of the industrial landscape. And if policymakers can unhook from our preconceptions of what aerospace is and what it does, we can hold policy open for a wider range of different technology solutions to pick off different parts of this carbon puzzle. We're not going to solve everything in our company by any stretch, but in the things that we do, there's a 90% reduction. We're not the only people doing that. We just look a little bit different to existing preconceptions of aircraft.
So, Sharon, I want to follow up with you because we talked a bit about the role not just in technologies on the supply side, but also demand side, resetting customer expectations around shipping. Is there a place for policy there that could affect some of those dynamics?
Well, I think one of the strange things about policy in this area is that I don't think government policy is actually caught up with e-commerce yet. It's very difficult to get statistics, et cetera, et cetera. So I think governments are a long way behind this, which actually makes research quite difficult. But there are things that could easily be done. Like, for instance, I mean, we had in the UK, I think in most countries, we used to have telephone boxes everywhere because people didn't have telephones. Now, to my mind, we need the same sort of thing with locker systems. So basically, if you have a locker system where you can leave, where delivery companies can leave the goods, where you can take your returns back to, etc., it saves so much energy because there are no failed deliveries. It means that companies could deliver overnight to those boxes, etc., etc. So it makes the whole system more efficient. And at the moment, many different companies are looking into setting up locker systems, but maybe we should just have, a government subsidized locker system that takes into account the fact that if you have lockers, it's better for everyone. And there's that sort of thing that I think is interesting to look at. Also, making sure that people have good connections all around, good digital connections all around the world, so that people can actually use digital systems a lot more easily. And again, the easier things are, the more efficient they can be in that sphere.
That's really interesting. So thank you all. I would now like to bring Mitch and Samantha back in, and I'm going to ask each of them for their rapid responses and reflections on what they've heard. So I guess first Samantha, then Mitch. In a minute or less, could you each tell me, for the last panel, what sort of resonated with you and what would you like to discuss further in this one?
Sure. I heard a couple of things that I think are really important. One of them is Sharon's comments on the need for education and consumer behavior. I couldn't agree more. And a lot of people care deeply about the climate, but they really don't understand what they can do in their day-to-day lives to reduce their own emissions. And so this education and offering better choices and different choices, I think, is a really helpful point. The second is Johannah's point about new fuels being more expensive. I think that's true, and we hope that these fuels become less expensive over time, but what that higher expense might also do is change thinking around supply chains and logistics and things that we want to ship long distances and things that we don't, or we want to ship quickly and that we don't. And so those initial high prices could in many ways drive change that could also help push emissions down.
And Mitch?
Yeah, I think that Sharon's comment about access points, a locker system, is a very relevant issue, especially in light of the issues around consumerism and consumer choice. Access points are paramount with respect to increasing efficiency of transport and goods movement. And so the more access points that you can do that help make not only the transport itself more near or nearshoring, but also the individual consumers' transportation needs to pick up or drop off those goods is a critical issue as well. And so I think that issue is, you can't lose sight of that not only are you increasing consumer choice and convenience for them, but you're also helping to reduce, in some cases, eliminate their carbon impacts with respect to their transport needs for either shipping or receiving of goods.
That's great. So I want to pick up on Samantha's point about education. Salid, I'd love to ask you, I mean, working around, it could be around fashion or it could be others. What do you see as the biggest things that are sort of a priority for educating consumers around the sustainability of moving goods around the world?
So education for us at the Slow Factory is looking at the system as a whole. Right now, we are working with several schools, design schools and fashion schools, on how do we redesign the system itself, whether it is decentralizing manufacturing, creating more local solutions, upcycling, using pre-existing textile instead of creating fashion from an agriculture to a shipping, tanning, dyeing, etc. So there are several solutions that already exist out there, and it's a matter of implementing them in a pre-existing system.
It's interesting, yeah. Mitch, I want to go back on something. We had talked a bit about possibly part of the answer here could be rethinking consumer expectations around shipping. Maybe how fast things need to get from point A to point B in many cases. Do you think that's possible? Is that something that could be part of the conversation? And do you think it will have to be in the future?
It's an interesting question. It's actually an interesting dilemma because, consumers they're concerned about the environment and want a more sustainable world, but they also want what they want when they want it. And so there's that. There are those competing. Those competing needs, if you will. I think a key solution goes back to what I was commenting on previously. About Sharon's comments, which is you can, in some ways, and there are hard choices that we've had to make and will have to make as we source or search for a zero carbon world. But there are ways to find win-wins, and if we can increase convenience points and increase those abilities to help consumers in a way to be more efficient and to be more sustainable. That win-win makes it much easier for everyone, right? The difficulty becomes when you start to prescribe specific solutions and you get into these issues of scarcity and demands by consumers and by individuals that they have to give more than they may be willing to do. You start to run into a lot of challenges. So I think that, having said that, I think that there are a lot of solutions that are really win-win, where you can rethink the distribution network, help consumers, end consumers, get goods in the time frame that they're looking to, and reduce those emissions therein. Access points, bundling of goods, and the like. I mean, think about it this way: freight transportation is really carpooling for packages. And so the more that you can do that and the more efficiencies that you can do in that respect, it benefit everyone.
So, I want to pivot a bit. Johannah, I'd love to ask you maybe to look into a crystal ball a little bit. And let's say, the world's nations really get serious about getting to zero emissions in the next 3 decades, as scientists say we really need to do if we want to avoid some of the worst consequences of global warming. I mean, take us or sketch out a picture a little bit of what that might look for shipping, both in the near term, medium term, and long term for actually solving this challenge. Like, what are some things we'd really start to see?
That's a really difficult question, but I'll do my best. So in the very short term, I think a commitment to that end objective, to a full decarbonization of the shipping sector, is incredibly important. It really focuses the mind of the sector as a whole. Currently, there is no such goal. In that the International Maritime Organization, the IMO, the regulator of the maritime sector, has set a 50% reduction target, but not a full decarbonization target. So that would be a very first step. And in fact, many companies around the world already support that and are calling for that step. Just yesterday, there was a big announcement in this regard. A next important step is a focused effort, a collaborative effort to have large-scale, sort of industrial-scale demonstration projects that can help refine and demonstrate the zero-emission technologies that we already know, at least what some of the potential candidate technologies might be, to test them at scale and to start bringing down the cost of those technologies and reduce the risks functionally. And then there's that's the early ramp up phase. And we're seeing some of that happening already. Companies are beginning to order zero emission ready vessels. They're beginning to put in place agreements around zero emission fuel deliveries and the like. And that's something that we're certainly working to catalyze. Then the next phase, that's the diffusion phase. That's really where we need to see the scale up. And that's where policy is so incredibly important. In that early phase, probably subsidies and the like can do a lot of the heavy lift, but at a later stage in the diffusion phase, we really need policy to help close the cost gap between the fossil solutions that we have today and the zero emission solutions that we have in the future. Some I think Bill Gates talks about a green premium. So there is a sort of and some of that can be paid through consumers paying for some of that, et cetera. But really, policy will play such an important role.
Right. That's that really is sketches out a great, vivid picture, at least on the optimistic side. I'd love to ask the others. Maybe I'll start with Samantha Bay. What else? Who wants to chime in? What potentially could block that sort of vision Joanne just sketched out from happening? Who would be the opponents there? What would be, the biggest reasons why that sort of optimistic vision of the future might fail?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly some winners in that scenario. Clearly, the planet is a winner in that scenario, but there are also some losers geopolitically and from a business sense. It's definitely scary for fossil fuel producers, particularly economies that are really dependent on fossil fuels, to hear the words ban the internal combustion engine. And so that could be a difficult sell. It's also difficult for countries that rely heavily on exports because they could see that increasing the price of their goods abroad. And so as we do this, we need to think really hard about global equity issues as we move forward and how to do things that are clearly good for all of us from an environmental point of view, but how to do that in a way that doesn't exacerbate poverty or exacerbate inequality globally or in particular countries. Because I would particularly be concerned about export-dependent economies in that scenario, and we'd have to find a way to square that circle in order to not make global inequity worse.
Yeah. So I might just run through, just because we're winding down time, quick comments from everyone in terms of just, whether they're optimistic that this is a sector that could be decarbonized and maybe what they think of as the biggest challenge to overcome. And we should keep these pretty quick. So I'm just going to go in order. Mitch, what do you think the sort of biggest challenge to overcome is here?
Well, I think the key issue, and something that I've long said, is that sustainability is a team sport. And that's in any sector. Transport is no different from that. And I think what it takes all of us working together. It takes policymakers, it takes businesses, it takes the educational and academia sector as well to do that. And I think that when you combine business know-how with scientific, technological, and educational prowess, that we can find solutions to these problems. It's not to say that it won't be difficult. It's not to say that there are not hard decisions to be made. But I generally tend to be optimistic with respect to the issue because, if you have negative thoughts and you think pessimistically, then you're likely to bring about that outcome. You've got to find the opportunities and the nexus points to really find the solutions that work and then implement them.
Yeah. Same question to you, Sharon. I mean, are you optimistic that we could solve this problem? And what do you sort of see as the biggest hurdle to surmount?
I think that solving the problem is a bit far stretched at the moment. And one of the things that I would like to raise is that we mustn't just look at the tailpipe emissions. We need to look at all the well-to-wheel emissions and everything that's involved in producing all these new technologies and things, because there's no use putting so much, having a good end product if it actually takes a load of production, a lot of energy in the production facilities. So I think we have to be careful that things that we put forward are not again, a bit greenwashing by just glimming over what the real issues are. So we need to look from everything from the start to the finish, the production to the end consumption.
Yeah. Tom, final thoughts on this?
I'm optimistic. I think we'll see a portfolio of different solutions, a wider variety of solutions than we've seen in the past. And I think as we've seen through the crisis we've just been through, what happened with vaccines, where we knew there was a crisis, we needed to respond quickly, and there were technology solutions that policy could accelerate. We've moved from climate change to climate crisis to climate emergency, and the same action can pull through technologies in a way that we've not seen up to now.
Yeah. And Celine, final thoughts?
Yes, the challenge is that the solutions exist. The biggest challenge is taking the risk to implementing them. And there is a financial risk that is on the shoulders of a lot of different brands in taking the route that is more sustainable. And sustainability, regeneration, all of these solutions that are already out there demand that the brands shift from their marketing funds into an impact fund, into a climate fund immediately. And that is a financial risk at the end of the day that will benefit us collectively.
Well, thank you to all of you. This has been such a great panel. I feel like I've learned a lot, particularly about this sector that just is not quite as visible. I mean, so often, as I mentioned at the beginning, the climate conversation around is, okay, let's put solar panels on homes, replace coal plants, get electric vehicles. And this is sort of the backbone of the global economy that really needs to be rethought in very important but also potentially difficult ways. So this has been great. I would love to hand it back over to Angela for her final reflections on this and what you heard today. What did you think, Angela?
I have so many thoughts, Brad, and I really had to work hard not to just jump in there several times. I thought it was a great discussion. But what I really heard was, as Samantha alluded to, and all of the panelists, there are no silver bullet solutions here. It's going to be a mix of solutions. And that's really what we're going to need if we're going to transform the entire transport industry. I also heard the need for strong policy support. And that is a message that businesses can and should take now and bring with them to COP26 and these important forums to say that we can get there, we want to get there, but we need policy to be a friend of business, and we need policy to help us make these changes. There's a need for collaboration. There's a need for everyone to do this. I sort of have feelings on the concept of some of these green solutions being more expensive, because it really depends on how you measure the cost, right? Whose account are we looking at? Are we, calculating the losses of biodiversity, the impact of climate change, of inequality, biodiversity? If we look at all that, I bet that the sustainable option usually comes out on top, actually. And there can be no business on a dead planet. So if the planet loses, we're all going to lose. It's going to be way more expensive in the end. But I also heard a lot of optimism and the will to change. So I'm also very optimistic. We will find solutions. We just need to accelerate and make sure that we stay on climate's timeline if we want to keep below 1.5 degrees, because if we don't do that, then all our other timelines will go down the drain anyway.
That's a great way to end. Thank you so much, Angela. So for the audience, I just ask, feel free to stick around to watch an exclusive interview between my colleague Veronica Chambers and After Antarctica director and producer Tasha Van Zandt, as well as polar explorer and educator Will Steger. Following the Q&A, you'll have exclusive access to view the international premiere screening of the documentary film titled After Antarctica. And one final note, if you enjoyed today's discussion, we look forward to welcoming each of you in October for our next digital event in the Netting Zero series. It's called Consider It Green, and you can sign up for that session on timesevents.nytimes.com. Thank you so much all for joining us today. This was really great, and we will see you next time. Thank you.
Thanks to Brad Plumer and his guests, Angela Hultberg, Samantha Gross, Mitch Jackson, Tom Grundy, Johannah Christensen, Sharon Cullinane, and Celine Simon. I'm Veronica Chambers, a narrative projects editor at the New York Times, and it's my honor to be here today with Tasha Van Zandt and Will Steger, and we're going to be talking about their extraordinary documentary, After Antarctica. To quote the filmmakers, In a dramatic attempt to bring awareness to the changing continent, an international expedition led by renowned explorer Will Steger embarked on the first ever coast-to-coast expedition across Antarctica in 1989. 6 explorers and their sled dogs braved howling storms, sub-zero temperatures, snow crevices, and other perils. And now, 30 years since this groundbreaking expedition, he heads out on the ice again in the documentary, this time to the opposite end of the planet. After Antarctica is an urgent message spanning both poles. So thank you for joining us, Tasha and Will. So we're going to start by showing you a short excerpt from the film.
I traveled in the polar regions for 50 years of my life. My first 25 years was before the changes. In the last 25 years, I've seen all the changes. And I'll go down in history for the last. You can't do the expeditions I did. The routes don't exist anymore. In the 80s, we were starting to get the first signals of climate change, but we needed a lot more data in Antarctica. So that's what we set out to do. And we decided right there we would form an international team of 6 people from 6 countries and cross Antarctica and draw world attention to Antarctica. Everyone that was involved in it sensed the energy. That was a piece of history that was unfolding. Preserving Antarctica, we were preserving the human race. It was about the future. When we landed on Antarctica, we were optimistic, and everything was new to us. But the interior is really an ungodly place, and it rejected us like a germ. We had 60 days of horrible storms and 55 below and 100 mile an hour wind. And the dogs were starting to freeze to death, and we were almost out of food. We could have just disappeared. Go straight downwind, Jeff. After the Transantarctica expedition in 1990, the carbon level rose to 350 parts per million, and that was the level that was predicted where the ice on the globe would start melting, and that's when it all started. The Transantarctica expedition wouldn't be possible today because 400 miles of the route is no longer ice, it's open ocean. Every ice shelf I've traveled on is disintegrated. And this all happened within the last 15 years. Antarctica definitely is the canary in the coal mine. And my exploring has taken me to being an eyewitness and bringing back the story of these areas that are unpeopled and untold and unexperienced. A place like Antarctica, it's like an ice age before people. And it's so foreign and it's so remote, but yet melting of that ice affects the rest of the world.
So we've just seen a clip from your extraordinary documentary. And Well, you say in the film that your expedition was the first and last of its kind. And it's a moment that was so significant. It was almost hard to grasp. Can you tell us when you realized that you would never be able to make that particular expedition again?
Well, it was our expedition was by dog team was across the longest traverse of Antarctica, 3,700 miles. The first 300 miles of that was across the Larsen ice shelf. And since that time, 30 years ago, the Larsen ice shelf is disintegrated. So the route itself is no longer repeatable because of the influence of climate change right now. And the fact that dogs are no longer allowed on the continent. That was the last of any dog sled expedition that we'll ever see in the history of Antarctica.
That's amazing. Tasha, I know that you're both from Minnesota. Is that correct?
Yes.
We are both from Minnesota.
Can you talk about, growing up and hearing about Will's work?
Yes. So growing up in Minnesota, Will was such a hometown hero and a local legend. And I remember hearing stories of his incredible expeditions across Antarctica and the North Pole, and reading National Geographic magazines and pulling out pictures as a kid and putting them on my wall. And one of my dreams, thanks to Will, was it really inspired me to have a passion about Antarctica and our polar regions and dreaming of someday going and documenting. So we actually met around 8.5 or 9 years ago. Will was giving a talk in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I introduced myself afterwards and shared that I would love to start collaborating and document in any way. And I think it was around a week or two later that we first came up and met with Will and got to see the homestead. So it's been a great journey.
Great tour.
Yes.
So, Will, one of the things that you talk about in your work is being an eyewitness. Was it partly being an eyewitness for people like Tasha to continue the work, be inspired by the work?
The eyewitness account was, 20 years ago when after the Larsen ice shelf broke up, that changed my life. I actually moved to Minneapolis to start the climate movement, actually. And where I got traction was the eyewitness of what I was seeing in the polar regions. At that time, 20 years ago, people didn't know really what climate change was. So it was a combination of bringing about the Arctic through adventure into an audience. And that at that time, it was through lecturing a live audience that way. But through Natasha and others, we've been able to do this, the live eyewitness through film, where you reach a lot more people. But now it's just changed because we've all have our own eyewitness account of climate change. I mean, this last summer was a tipping point, I think, in that we are now seeing the climate going out of control. And it's pretty obvious what's happening now. So we all have our own stories now.
One of the things that was so powerful to me about the film is in that early footage from 1989, it becomes clear that climate is being talked about in the media as climate change is something that's happening far away. When things started to happen like Katrina in Louisiana, what was your feeling about how close it got? Like I know you have the climate generation. Can you just talk about the arc between us understanding that the Antarctica was going to affect Louisiana and Florida and New York and California?
Well, early on, for people to make that connection, it was really difficult. I think we've all seen a big change, especially in the media in the last 5-6 years, where the climate became relevant to a lot of our lives. We all became the eyewitnesses. And since we all have a personal story, we're understanding it more, we're paying more attention. If you look at the media right now, I mean, climate is usually front page. Especially this last summer it is. So it's something that we're seeing, but what we're seeing now is something going out of control. And we no longer can sugarcoat the topic anymore. It's right now. I think that's good because now we can face up to the fact that we have a challenge here. There is hope. We have technology, but we're going to have to adapt. And how are we going to do that? That's the big question right now.
One of the things that comes across in the documentary is you talk about, the land almost rejecting you and this hostility. And you just mentioned the word hope. And I in 50 years of doing this work, how do you keep how did you keep going? How did you kind of keep your eye on the hope ball, so to speak?
Well, I'm naturally a optimist, but I'm really grounded in fact and reality. So I've studied weather all my life, so I know what's happening here. I have the utmost faith in the human spirit, but the human spirit needs to cooperate in order for us to, solve anything or in order to adapt. And we're seeing that around the rest of the world. And I really believe even in America now, politically, I think it's going to change around climate. I think we're going to get cooperation. Our expedition in 89, 90 was about international cooperation, because at that time they were going to open up Antarctica for the exploration of minerals, which was basically the end of that environment down there. So we needed to get all the world leaders, all 27 of them, the treaty nations, change that and sign agreement, which they eventually did in 1991 to save Antarctica. And we did that through international cooperation. And whenever I question anything, I look at Antarctica, I look at the Paris Peace Agreement, climate agreement, and there I see, the cooperation. And it's through cooperation that is where we really stand united. We need that, but we all have to do our part individually. We have to, first of all, build our own awareness. We can do that by our actions and by the intention of wanting to learn and wanting to be part of it. But just a single person can't change this. We have to reunite with other people. We have to realize the power of our sphere of influence, but especially when we connect with other people, that's when we get power and we can start making things happen.
That's a great answer. Tasha, I know that you went through this extraordinary treasure trove of archival footage, but you also used technology like drones to capture new footage. Can you talk about some of the mediums and techniques that you used to put together the film?
There was so much footage to work with because Will is an incredible documentarian in his own right and has been documenting his journeys throughout his entire life. So there was remarkable Super 8 footage, 16 millimeter footage, photographs. Will's an incredible photographer as well who's documented many of these expeditions. So we had so much archive to work with, and what really resonated with us was being able to see the 16 millimeter footage from the Transantarctica French team that documented along the way. And they dropped in around 4 or 5 times on the expedition, and we're an incredible team of adventurers and filmmakers who were able to capture this stunning details of the expedition itself. And like Will just mentioned, so much of the expedition was to really draw world attention and awareness to Antarctica and our need to preserve and protect it. And so this team was able to document it in a way that was able to be shared through news and media and really galvanize and get people excited about this journey and this incredible otherworldly place. And so going through all of that footage was really so special to be able to experience that, and all of these stories we had heard from Will, to see footage that really could bring that to life. But also one of the pieces of the archives that was most exciting to us is that in Antarctica during that journey, Will recorded audio journals along the way. So in the film currently, when we're in the past, we're really dropping into Will's memories and worlds through bringing to life these audio journals and innermost thoughts throughout this incredible journey that he was on. And then in the present day, I worked with my fantastic partner and producer and director of photography on the project, Sebastian Zek, and we really were able to do the production as a 3-person team, heading out in the fields and documenting. And Will was so gracious with us in being able to document this journey, and we really wanted to be able to show the scale of these places. So I filmed a lot of aerial cinematography, and Sebastian filmed incredible footage on the ground, and we were able to really document as best as we could out in this vast space.
That's so great. I just have 2 more questions. I wanted to ask, I'm so glad that you mentioned Will's audio journals, because those were so powerful to me. And I wanted to ask Will, what was it like to hear your younger self in this film. What were your thoughts about the person that you were and the person you are now?
That was such a powerful experience because of, first of all, the six of us were really bonded together, 6 people from 6 different countries. But it took a lot of strength individually, just to keep yourself going and alive. And I was we were all so much in the moment at that time, which wasn't a very pleasant moment to be in at times. But I listened to the tapes, and it's almost like I'm still there. And it's so much, it's just so spontaneous and intuitive. It surprises me in a sense how timeless the tapes seem to me. It captures your breath and your moment. You can hear so much that's almost subconscious in those tapes. What's going on in the background, which seems very simple, but just the tinkering with the stove and sounds of the dogs in the background. It's like being there.
Yeah, it's been just such a joy to be able to listen to those tapes, and has really felt like we were able to transport into Will's world and these memories through hearing the sound of the tents flapping in the wind and the dogs howling outside. It really was so vivid listening to those. And we also worked with an incredible team in post-production as well, our editor Don Bernier and co-editor Dana Lemon, and over producers and everyone who carried us to the finish line to really craft that message. And we wanted to be able to show that theme of hindsight and hope, looking into the future and looking onto the past now.
There's so many wonderful lines and moments in the film. There's a moment where you talk about saving Antarctica being about saving the human race and being about something so much bigger than ourselves or than one individual. What do you both hope the film will do and inspire for the next generation of explorers?
I think in so many ways, Will has taught me that we're all explorers in this life, and we can all find ways to really leave a positive impact behind. In so many ways, I feel this story is a story of holding on to hope in the face of the unknown. And I think we're currently all in a place right now where there are many unknowns in terms of the climate crisis, the pandemic, the world as it is right now. But if we can find ways to use our voice to unite others together in cooperation and hold on to that hope, so much greatness can be achieved. So I hope people are really able to feel the inspiration that myself, Sebastian, and my team have felt in getting to know Will's story, and that can live on for others as well.
For myself, I think it still comes down to the cooperation, not just international cooperation, but here in America, we're a split country right now, and we're going through really social changes, and more so than ever, diversity is really our power, and uniting around that diversity as individuals and as teams of people, as a country and as states. It's really where the hope lies. It's also the brilliance of the mind, the science, the technology, everything that we have at our fingertips right now. And there is hope, but we are going to have to adapt to what's going to come to us. And it's a paradox, ultimate paradox of what we're looking at. We're looking at the end of life as we know it, and on the other end, there's so many opportunities right now for greatness and for adaptation and for building new economies that will employ so many other people that are at this point are unemployable. So there is a lot of hope here, and that was the lesson that we learned in Antarctica. That all nations came together, the people came together, and we were able to set aside Antarctica, for a continent of peace, for science only, and that message is still really loud and clear right now. As we are all united around the issues that we do face, and I think we really have to come together as a country and as a species.
Thank you, Tasha Van Zaan and Will Steger, for talking to us about your incredible film, After Antarctica. All the attendees to this panel will have a chance to see the film in full. There'll be more information in the chat, and Tasha can share some more about how to follow up with the film and follow along on its journey.
Well, thank you so much for having us. And to follow along with the film, you can sign up for updates at afterantarctica.com. And we're so glad to be able to share the film with you all.
Thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see you all in the October Netting Zero session.